Chapter 1. The young woman standing in front of him was smiling. Cross was sure of this, as her mouth was turned up at both corners, which was a definite sign. He wasn't sure what it meant though, because he didn't know her. With people he knew, he would note the upturned mouth, together with what had been said, combine it with the tone in which it had been said, and make his inference. Context was everything for Cross, his interpreter. Only then would he be able to come to his conclusion. Happy, ironic maybe, sometimes exasperated. With some work colleagues, he had a mental library of their smiles, frowns, inquiring expressions, catalogued in his head for reference. Frame grabs from previous conversations, which he could then recognize and use to determine his reaction. This was a necessary process for Cross, as smiles meant nothing to him per se. They didn't trigger any innate emotional response in him. They didn't make him feel anything. He didn't empathize. Smiles were therefore just another thing in life that needed interpretation. He had heard it said that some people actually smiled with their eyes, as if this gave their smile more meaning, as if it was some profound inroad to their inner soul. For Cross, this was absolute nonsense. It was just a physiognomic accident. All this girl had said was hi, and she was now waiting in the ensuing awkward silence for the customary return greeting. But it wasn't forthcoming. What she didn't know was that Cross didn't work like that. His brain wasn't wired that way. Most people would fill the vacuum with a hello. Then, not knowing what the young woman wanted, would follow with the inquiry, "What can I do for you?" But Cross was different. Her smile, he concluded, was nervous. She was waiting for something, but he wasn't sure what it was. Why didn't she just tell him? That was, after all, presumably why she had come up to him in the first place. People seemed to do this all the time. It was so puzzling. "I'm Mackenzie," she said. Well, that was a start, an introduction. "You're D.S. Cross." Why did people persist in telling him who he was? "Well, nice to meet you." She paused another moment, just to make sure Cross wasn't going to respond. He wasn't, so she left. He watched her go, then turned his attention back to the corpse lying at his feet. It was the corpse of an elderly man. At first glance, maybe late 70s, 80s. His weathered face told the story of a life led lately on the streets. With the homeless, though, age was such an amorphous concept. Cross had come across several he would have sworn were of retirement age, only to discover they were in their early 30s. He examined the man. Filthy, his overcoat matted with the dirt, and tied at the waist with a piece of string. He was unshaven, with long fingernails under which were semicircles of black dirt. A cloud of stale alcohol wafted up from the body, obliterating the cold early morning smell of rot and autumnal decay in the air. A smell Cross had always appreciated when examining a dead body. It scented him. It was his olfactory equivalent of keeping your eye on the horizon when in a moving boat to prevent seasickness. To Cross's annoyance, Uniform had already dismissed this as a homeless on homeless crime, and, having reached that conclusion, had lost interest. Cross was already pretty sure they were wrong. This was because of the carriage bag the old man was still hanging on to. In it, some scraps of food and 6 cans of strong cider. Cider was life's blood on the streets, and if alcohol happened not to be your thing, then it was currency with a street value higher than gold. Cross studied the corpse's face. Who was this man? How did he end up here, like this? What events in his life led him to this moment? What was his story? He was always drawn to cases like this, cases of the dispossessed, the outsider. He related to them because in many ways he was one himself. An outcast, a social misfit, a curiosity, someone it was easier not to engage with, to walk past, avoid. This was what interested him in murder in the first place. The ability to give a victim a voice when they no longer had one of their own. All the more compelling if the victims had had no voice when they were alive. Loners who had no one to speak for them when they had gone. No friends or family asking questions of the police, demanding to know what had happened. Cross had received the call that morning when he was having breakfast at Tony's. He ate in this particular cafe in Redland every morning, and every morning he ate exactly the same thing. Every weekday morning that was, unless he was away, which was rare. It was handy for Cross as he lived directly above it in a small flat. He had walked in and sat at his usual table, which had a rather incongruous, chipped plastic reserved sign at its middle. The cafe was populated by a group of regulars eating their full Englishes. Billers, taxi drivers, with their money bags in the middle of the table, pensioners up early out of habit, hoping someone would say hello to make them feel like they were part of the human race again. Men buried in their tabloids. All the customers were men. Cross didn't come at weekends, despite the contiguous convenience of his flat. This was because, on Saturdays and Sundays, Tony let a young couple come in and make brunch. All poached eggs, avocados, huevos rancheros, lattes, sweet corn fritters, smoked salmon, and creme fraiche. It had become quite the hot spot with the young, and it gave Tony 2 days off. But it wasn't for Cross. It wasn't because she felt out of place in the young, bearded hipster crowd. That was, after all, something he dealt with on a daily basis. It was the length of the seemingly permanent queue that he didn't have the patience for. Dodger and Whiff, for they were the young couple's names, had offered for him to jump the queue. A horrifying suggestion. He couldn't possibly accept preferential treatment. He was a policeman after all. Before that, a Thai couple had done a weekly 3-night residency, cooking Thai food. It was so successful that they had been able, with Tony's blessing and a not inconsiderable financial investment, to open their own restaurant in St. Paul's nearby. Morning, George. Morning, Anthony. Cross was the only customer to call him this. The first time he walked in, he saw the alcohol license above the door in the name of Anthony Corson, and had used that name ever since. No one corrected him, so there was no reason for him to think otherwise. Tony walked over with tea in a cup and saucer. Everyone else was drinking from mugs. He placed it in front of Cross and removed the reserved sign. Cross then produced a knife and fork from his pocket and put the paper napkin in his lap. He had no need to order. Tony knew what he wanted. He and the waiter came over to Cross's table a little later with his breakfast. Nothing odd in that, except that all the components were on separate plates. A fried egg, bacon, mushrooms, toast, baked beans. Bon appetit, said Tony, putting another empty plate in front of Cross. Merci, Cross replied. Cross placed the fried egg on his plate and carefully cut the white away from the yolk and ate it. He then placed each of the 3 rashers of bacon equidistantly from the edge of the plate, the middle rasher underneath the yolk. Tony had ensured in the kitchen that each rasher was identical in length. Cross's phone rang. He checked who it was before he answered. Cross, I'll be straight over. But he went back to his breakfast, breaking the yolk with the left-hand rasher of bacon. He ate as he observed through the condensation on the window, observing life on the street outside. The area had changed in the 25 years he had lived there. It had become quite gentrified over the years, and this was reflected in the changing nature of the shops around him. They had become more bespoke and upmarket, more artisan. A bakery, a Michelin-starred restaurant, Wilkes. It was as if the more affluent area of Clifton had run out of room and spread inexorably west over White Ladies Road into Redland. He now recognized some local people as they went about their everyday routine at this time in the morning. He amused himself by building an imaginary picture of their lives, their jobs, their marital status, their sexuality. In his head, he had created an alternative Redland with its social infrastructure and personalities all cast by him. When he arrived at the crime scene, which was on the edge of the downs, close to the gorge, Cross was stopped by an uniformed policeman. This wasn't unusual for Cross, and in many ways it was quite understandable. He had arrived on a bicycle, fully kitted out in a day-glow green helmet with a flashing light and digital camera attached to the top, day-glow cycling windbreaker, day-glow bicycle clips round his ankles, and a small backpack over his shoulder. He looked more like an eccentric, absent-minded, 50-year-old geography teacher who had lost his way en route to an orienteering field trip than a serving detective sergeant in the major crime unit of the Avon and Somerset police. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to stay behind the tape," said the policeman. "Of course. I have, said Cross, rummaging through his pockets. He was in no way annoyed. Quite the opposite, in fact. If the policeman didn't know who Cross was, he should, of course, ask for identification. In fact, Cross would go as far as to say that even if the police constable did know him, he should still, strictly speaking, ask for identification. Cross believed in order, in proper procedures being followed. Life would be so much easier if everyone did likewise. He finally took off his backpack as DSOT approached, a black single mother of two in her late 30s. She was Cross's current partner. "It's okay, he's with us," she said. Cross finally produced his ID. "DS Cross," he informed the policeman, who then lifted the tape for him to go under. "I'm sorry, sir." "No need to apologize. Just doing your job," Cross replied. But with that, he remained rooted to the spot, looking expectantly at the policeman, who then asked, "Was there anything else, sir?" "DS Cross, 2117, and the time is..." He looked at his watch. 9:04. The policeman was confused. "For the log," Cross explained. "He's right," said OT. "You should be taking a log of everyone in and out of the crime scene." "Oh, of course." "Sure," said the PC. He got out his notebook and entered Cross's details as Cross looked on. 2117. That's correct. Cross turned and was a little surprised to see that OT had started walking away. "Josie?" She stopped in her tracks and turned back. "DSOT 3472. I arrived about 15 minutes ago," she said, as Cross watched the constable writing it down. Satisfied, he then wheeled his bike after her. She knew what was coming next, the inevitable lecture. Cross simply couldn't let this stuff go. In fact, it was more than that. It actually really upset him. He couldn't cope if procedure was not followed correctly. "It's really important," he informed her, gravely. "I know, but I'm the only one who's here," she replied. He gave her that look she knew so well. The look that said he was waiting for her to tell him what he already knew. That she wasn't telling the entire truth. What his father would call a white lie, another expression he had never understood. Why should a lie have a color that made it different? Why were there no other colored lies, like red or yellow? But he had learned that, logic aside, this meant it wasn't a grave, terrible, consequential lie. "Apart from local CID, no harm done," she went on. He stopped walking and looked at her. Okay, I'll get them all to sign in," she conceded. Cross's obsession with order and procedure was what made him one of the most successful detectives in the major crime unit of the Avon and Somerset Police in terms of his conviction rate. 97% of his cases resulted in successful convictions. He had a great set of deductive skills and was something of a legend in the interview room, but it was his detailed presentation of cases to the CPS, his ordered collation of evidence, which was genuinely astonishing. His dogged, slavish adherence to procedures was extraordinary, if at times frustrating for those working with him. Prosecutors beamed when they saw his name attached to a case because they knew that everything would have been meticulously pored over and set out in a fully comprehensive order. Cautions, chains of evidence, and warrants would have all been executed properly. None of the shortcuts some policemen employed, which often led to an arrest, but invariably to a collapse of the case in court, which was compelling. But it wasn't just this efficacy which they held in such esteem. It was the case he built up in the interview room, which was so compellingly incriminating. No one in the police force utilized the no-comment response with such lethal, pinpoint accuracy. Suspects answered a series of carefully constructed questions with no comment, as instructed by their lawyer. Cross was more than happy for them to do this, as he built a picture of what he thought or in some cases knew, had happened, at the same time as he withheld nuggets of evidence from them. When he judged the timing was right, and they had dug themselves into a hole of adequate depth, they were confronted with this evidence. They then had to change no comment to some sort of response, which basically built a picture of their guilt. It was a chess game, and Cross was the grandmaster. They just didn't know it.